let's talk about 1D and all the very many interesting aspects of the company you work with now. So I'll start with kind of a more generic question that talks about our anode supply chain here in the United States and North America in its entirety. It's pretty weak, and it's a bit of a panic when you look at the trajectory of the electrification business here. It's on a slope that's going to be really hard to maintain, especially as we continue to try to leverage foreign resources to achieve that slope, if you will. So, you've got some thoughts on how that might get fixed, if you will. How can we fix our North American supply chain as it relates to anodes for lithium-ion batteries?
Actually, it's an excellent question. And let me first with deepening the problem and then maybe indicating some solution. So if you look at the anode is essentially for lithium-ion batteries used in EV, almost exclusively graphite today. There's a little bit of other things like silicon powder, silicon oxide, but the vast majority of the weight of all of the EV cell batteries on the anode side is graphite. Maybe, 60, 70 kilograms of graphite per EV battery. It's the number one weight in an EV battery.
It's like 25-30%, I think, right?
Yeah, so it's a big chunk. And one thing that is difficult for people to grasp is that the raw materials of graphite comes either from petroleum coke or from mined graphite. But that's not suitable for use in batteries. What is suitable is something that has been processed. And the processing is not easy. You have to remove impurities, you have to shape the particles so that they have a certain dimensions, and you have to do certain coating to establish the fact that they should be stable in the battery over 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 cycles. And all of that processing requires large investment and a lot of energy. And if you roll back the tape, maybe a decade ago, the leaders in that field were initially Japanese companies like Hitachi Chemical and Mitsubishi Chemical, and also some Korean companies like POSCO. And then when about 5 years ago, the sales of EVs started growing, with Tesla asking their suppliers to invest in larger capacity and reduce price, essentially the Chinese suppliers agreed to make enormous amount of investments, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, into increasing the supply of synthetic and natural graphite, while at the same time reducing cost, i.e. reducing the price at which they were selling the graphite to the EV cell makers. And that's a strategy that had worked in solar cells, because solar cells were invented in the United States and in Europe. But if you look today, 93% of all the solar cells are made in China. And the same trajectory went for a lot of materials in the battery space, where the processing of those materials was made in China for essentially three reasons: availability of very inexpensive capital, speed at which you could permit the factories, and then the availability of a lot of energy, especially coal plant energy in Mongolia that could supply, without regards for carbon footprint, very cheap energy in very large quantities. And as a result of that, today, virtually 100% of the graphite used in the EV cell factories in the United States and in Europe is imported from China. And as you know, as of yesterday, there is basically new regulation in China that is going to restrict some of the export of those things. And the question is, how do you get supply chains in America or in Europe? And so there is large amount of reserves of natural graphite. There is plenty of petroleum coke. And there are some companies that are already been investing for a decade. A couple of examples, one in Louisiana called Sierra Resources, publicly traded, with a mine in Mozambique. They have an offtake agreement with LG and with Tesla. And another one in Canada called Nouveau Monde Graphite in Quebec, who has been, a fantastic mine of 350,000 tons underground reserves, but a small manufacturing operation today and an offtake agreement being negotiated with Panasonic. And so you would say, well, that's pretty simple. That's two examples amongst others. There are also companies in the synthetic graphite like Novonix and Avignon and so on. So they should have no problem scaling up and offer an alternative to the OEMs and EV cell makers. And the same thing is true for POSCO, a Korean company. The problem actually is an economic problem, is that if you're trying to do project financing and you say to the customers and the bankers, in order to go from, let's say, 5,000 tons of processing, which is a demonstration level processing, to, let's say, 40,000 tons manufacturing capacity of EV grade graphite, I'm going to need $800 million. And it's going to be 600 million in debt and 200 million in equity, for example. And you try to raise that money to scale up. You need a business plan. And that business plan has a bunch of numbers where the fundamental assumption is the price at which you can sell the graphite to the OEMs. And of course, the advantage is that that graphite coming from North America is better from the point of view that the US government is offering a rebate of $7,500 per car if you source enough of the material in North America. So you put those things together, it should be a no-brainer. That's not the case. It's very difficult for a couple of reasons. One is that the incentives will disappear at some point in the future, because as we have more and more EVs being sold, the government cannot afford to pay $7,500 per EVs. So any of the OEMs that is planning for their production has to take into account what is the right cost for the material I'm buying to put in the EV cell that goes into the battery pack that goes into my EVs, so that I can reduce the cost of the battery packs and make affordable EVs, which is the majority of the market. And therefore, they have to assume what is the price without the benefits of the incentive. And the second piece is the bankers that are trying to raise the debt say, well, what happened if the OEMs choose to buy, natural or synthetic graphite that are imported from China, which even after tariffs can be purchased for $5-6 per kilogram instead of the $8 or $9 per kilogram in the business case of the North American supplier. And now if you try to decrease the $8 or $9 per kilogram to 5 or 6, suddenly there is not enough profit margins to pay off the debt, and the project financing is very, very hard. And so the problem for North American supply chain is not just an issue of resources or talent or expertise or permitting, all of which, of course, exist, but it can be solved. It's fundamentally, how do you compete against a country that can export vast quantities and that they've spent the last 5 to 10 years developing the production capacity to the level where the economy of scale allows them to sell with no profit or very slim profit at a price that nobody else can compete with. That is the problem.
Now, didn't we just help the problem, though, with China and their new restrictions? It should limit the supply at that low price and maybe cause the price to go up and help everyone's business case to do the investment. I'm knocking wood, hoping that's true.
Yeah, that was the hope when United States imposed tariffs on solar cells, and China responded with tariffs on polysilicon. And at the end of the day, those tariffs work exactly in the opposite direction in the long term. So I don't think that's the solution. It may help in the near term. It will not help in the long term. So I've been thinking about this exact problem for more than a decade. And I'll share my very simple view about this. There is only one way to compete, and that's innovation. And let me explain what that means by innovation. Innovation is process innovation in which the West, whether it's United States or Europe, can come up with things that are new and patented, which increase the value and decrease the cost, so that you can react to the customer needs to have lower cost batteries on the one hand, which is a must, and at the same time, if something that is protectable because of the patent law, so that it cannot simply be copied in China or in Brazil or in Malaysia and exported to the United States. And this has worked well in other industries. If you take semiconductor, okay, in semiconductor, there is a bunch of rules that have acted to support what we call Moore's law. So those rules are essentially two types of rules. One is the specialization of various companies in the supply chain for semiconductor. And the other one is the IP strategy of the industry. So if you look at semiconductor chips today, the West has still a 10-year advantage over China. So you have TSMC in Taiwan that can buy very, very sophisticated extreme UV lithography from a Dutch company in Holland called ASML. And that's well in advance of any machine that exists in China. It's protected by IP. And the IP from the chip design point of view, you can get it from ARM, which is a UK company that recently went public. And then companies like Apple can actually take the ARM semiconductor IP to design the Apple silicon. And then that Apple silicon chip design can be shipped to TSMC in Taiwan that use the ASML factory equipment to produce the world's most sophisticated wafers with the most incredible chips that you find in your MacBook Pro and MacBook Air and AirPods and iPhone. And that has worked. And that has worked because the industry organized itself in a way that the supply chain leverages innovation in a very cogent business model. And I think that what needs to happen in the battery industry is something similar to that.